So yeah, I thought, thank you so much for agreeing to join, first of all. I'm really excited to have this conversation, not least because, Tzuchien, your essay packed so much in, and I feel like there are plenty of questions that could open it up in whole new directions. So I suppose the first question that I thought I'd kick off with is that I contacted you and said, the philosopher's doing an issue on where is philosophy going, looking at questions around the future of philosophy. And you said, how about something on the Analytic-Continental divide? So I was wondering, why was that topic something that you felt was especially pertinent to you in relation to the future orientation of philosophy?
Yeah, great question. I think because we operate in institutions that believe that's true, that there's a divide. We have colleagues that think it's real, but it's sort of something you wouldn't write about it. I mean, it's sort of like not a thing that creates, it's not what you're hired to do, like in an institution, right? So I have my primary research, I do 17th century philosophy of physics, I do history of physics, I do 18th century metaphysics, but sort of you don't really get an opportunity to really think through or to write about the Analytic-Continental divide. Some people do it. I mean, but I think it's decidedly more rare. So it was just an opportunity to do that. I mean, and also I think the last 20 years or so, maybe it's really heated up in the last 10 years, there have been kind of philosophical movements, tendencies that tend to meld many things together. Now, whether either side, if that the distinction is real, would claim these people is, of course, a whole other matter. And I suppose that was just an opportunity to think about who are the most interesting people out there and what is their relationship to this so-called divide. Yeah. That's the reason.
That's great. Thanks, Pete. On your website, you say that your philosophical interests include everything, more or less. So in that sense, you're a great person for this kind of conversation, because you don't place your sort of interest strictly in one camp. But I thought I'd start by saying you describe yourself as a systematic philosopher. And obviously when we think of the word systematic, according to the caricature, we're thinking continental. They're the kind of system builders, whereas the analytic philosophers are slightly more modest under-laborers to the sciences. So what do you mean by a systematic philosopher, and how do you situate that idea within this putative divide?
I'm so to weirdly, let's draw on some analytic sources for that idea. So like I've always been a big fan of Wilfred Sellers's claim that philosophy is about how everything in the broadest possible sense of thing hangs together in the broadest possible sense of hang together, right? And I think Wilfred Sellers is a really good example of someone who's clearly a systematic thinker, but who never produced like a magnum opus or a tome in which it's all contained. And there are thinkers like this throughout history. Leibniz, very classic example. Peirce, these thinkers who clearly had interests that spread over everything within and outside of philosophy, and indeed, the boundaries between the two things have only kind of emerged more precisely recently. But I think that there are clearly people who have an intention to think broadly about variety of topics within philosophy and think about how it is that they connect and how they potentially inform one another. You can list other examples in the analytic tradition. So another classic example is David Lewis. Like, I disagree with basically everything he ever thought, but like very clearly has this kind of systematic architectonic conception, even if the attitude that it's presented with is precisely the opposite of the kind of bombast of like German idealism. It's this kind of casual, like, let's just think about everything.
Can I come in here? Can I
go for it.
sort of, I mean, So, I mean, I like everything you said. I mean, but I think, for example, the experience of reading Lewis, it ends up being systematic, right? I mean, insofar as that he's a great practitioner of consistent thinking, you're going to end up with a system if you've said enough things, right?
Yeah.
But he's trying to solve some specific issues.
But what Lewis doesn't have really is methodology. And I think
Sure.
And I think
Yeah.
I think that's the big sort of the big divide. I mean, so
that's funny. He thinks he doesn't have a methodology.
Well, this is the thing: is that analytic philosophy thinks it is a methodology, at least in that period.
In the original, yes,
there is a method that we're following, and really what they had was a style, which isn't the same thing. And
yeah, some people had style.
Well, yeah. But whereas, you know, like if you go back to German idealism, which is the the archetype of the high point of the grand sort of system building, it always begins from a certain set of methodological concerns, like where do we start?
Yeah, of course.
Like what's the foundation from which we unfold the systematic concerns? And that's certainly less prevalent.
I mean, there's also this thing of sort of like, where is the state of human knowledge and what kind of foundations are we giving to it? So I think Kant was driven by those kinds of questions. Hegel, you know, the German idealist tradition. But even if you even go back earlier to somebody like Descartes, right? Sort of like, you know, where are we sort of, you know, how do we set people up for acquiring truth? In the broadest sense, as you mentioned. But
if I can bring in another example, right? The continental tradition has systematic thinkers who aren't methodological. So my clear example would be Deleuze, who I love. Deleuze is very clearly a systematic thinker, but there isn't a beginning.
Right.
There's no foundation from which this is what my aborted initial PhD sort of proposal was like, how the hell do you get into Deleuze and justify it?
Yeah, but again, I think that's also, you know, a stylistics involved in Deleuze. You know, you don't think so? Okay.
Well, there's definitely style there, but I think there's more of a, I don't know, maybe this is just me being a bit of more of a partisan of Deleuze. Like Deleuze isn't ignorant of certain methodological considerations. Like Deleuze is ignorant of Hegel or Heidegger or these people who have kind of one core question. Deleuze makes a certain conscious choice not to take that approach. And there are still certain overarching themes one can identify that spread throughout the whole. But I don't want to talk about too much about Deleuze.
No, of course. But I mean, I would say that also in your description, there were sort of thinkers in this mix that are kind of, I mean, there was a paragraph that was deleted from the original draft, which is about pragmatism. And that's where we could sort of think about Sellers and the now very popular Brandom, and also you mentioned Peirce, and this whole interesting thing, right? Because if there's the continent is the continent for Great Britain, right? So the Americans have always been this like third force that is both a kind of refuge for certain kind of quote unquote continental philosophy, right? So it's sort of, you know, German philosophy and French philosophy all have germinated. I guess this is some of the content of my essay. But it's also an opportunity for different kinds of things to happen in the sort of vastness of the sort of that other continent. So that's, you know, I think pragmatism is decidedly something that can easily absorb, you know, French and German philosophy, Italian philosophy, at the same time as being involved in the kinds of conversations that, like logical empiricism wants to engage in, for example.
Absolutely. Just to because I know we've just gotten bogged down again in like giving a lot of different philosophers like funny distinctions, just to bring it back to what Anthony was originally asking about being a systematic philosopher. So to kind of like really condense it down in a way without giving examples. Like I think there is, so I'm a total partisan of the Platonic trinity of cardinal virtues: truth, goodness, and beauty. Right? There's a interesting historical story about why those three get associated, but I think you can tie it back to Plato, although it's more complicated. But I think like a good systematic philosopher wants to say something about all three and how they're related. Right? You want at the very least, there's got to be something in both theoretical and practical philosophy and how the two things are actually interconnected. Whether or not you think aesthetics is an aspect of that, I think that's an aspect of practical philosophy, but like it's that at the very least, there's got to be a kind of connection of those two things. I think, yeah, at least that's something that's important to me philosophically. That to be able to transit back and forth, be able to connect the two.
I agree. I mean, I don't have enough audacity to think that I could do it. I mean, I could but I could that I could think that I would maybe engage with other philosopher or other thinkers who are in the transit or at the limit, and sort of think through some of these things with them. But I feel like I don't have enough audacity to sort of say I'm working towards a system that can do that, or and so,
well, historically, right, systematic ambitions and systematic successes are, there's a lot of systematic ambitions. There's a lot of there's far more prolegomena philosophical systems written by an order of magnitude than there are actual philosophical systems. So
fair enough. Good.
Okay, so I'll come in again now. Thanks. I like that idea that I bring in a question. You two, I mean, you two are old friends from the conference circuit, etc. So always feel free to go back and forth. So obviously, one of the things that we have in this discussion of the Analytic-Continental divide is quite a well-told story. So the analytic tradition has the sort of logical formal notation, has things like necessary and sufficient conditions. The continental tradition is perhaps less clear in its writing style, perhaps a little bit more poetic, perhaps rather more grandiose, also perhaps encouraged more towards engaging in social change. It's almost as if the default implicit political stance of analytic philosophy is a very modest liberalism, whereas within the continental tradition, you quite often have a lot of Marxists and these kind of things. So with those are sort of, if you like, some of the things that most people that have thought about it or read about it come up with. But I suppose starting with you, Tzuchien, what do you think are the most kind of interesting questions that that this divide raises today, or looking into the future?
So I think to also just to respond to your description just a moment ago, I mean, I think that there is a clear, let's say, methodological background because of how universities teach philosophy. And so, and I think the continental tradition has history as its basis for a kind of, not necessarily that continental philosophers use history as a methodology, but there's a kind of basis in a kind of historical introduction into the topic. And continental philosophers tend to think about the evolution of ideas, think about their own ideas through their evolution, through their relationship with the tradition. Even if they're trying to do like sort of active violence to the tradition, right? For example, like the famous line from Deleuze, just to come back to our favorite guy, that he wants to, that Spinoza encule Hegel, right? I mean, I don't know if those kind of rude words are meant to be said. Is it okay to be rude?
I think we're okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Spinoza asks Hegel, right? I mean, that's, I mean, only if you care about that history would you try to pose your philosophy in that way, right? So even even if you're trying to do active violence to the canon, to the tradition, it comes from a position of having been taught in that tradition, and perhaps even having taught in that tradition like Deleuze did. And the other thing about political, let's say, political stripe, I think, I mean, I think the early formation of so-called analytic philosophy was very politically active, and they tend to be liberal only because of the national conditions in which they were brought up in, right? So the liberal tradition in say Great Britain or in the United States, right? So it's not as if the philosophy makes you a liberal, right? Because you could very you can imagine like the sort of the anarchist facts. So if the Vienna School had stayed in Austria, right, and had gone through the war and had the same set of kind of resistant or partisan heroes that, say, French philosophy did, right, with all the mythology about Cavaillés and Lotman and Sartre to some degree, right? You would also have a properly left-wing tradition within that thing. It's just that.
Although I think this is one of the interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry if I hit it. Well,
no. Yeah, go
right.
Please.
So one of the things that I think is just to come off the point about history in continental philosophy. I think one of the things that's good about what's happened to analytic philosophy, or at least philosophy, more like analytic departments, in the past 20 years, is that not only has history become more important, but the history of analytic philosophy itself has become more important. So analytic philosophy has become a lot less ahistorical. There's still plenty of ahistorical analytic philosophy, but there's now people kind of going back and actually studying like Carnap and the Vienna Circle and these thinkers as continental thinkers have been studying Kant, and this is good for a variety of reasons. But I think one of the interesting things that's come out of that is sort of people reconnecting with the politics of the Vienna Circle.
I
mean, one of my favorite things to say to continentalists to rile them up has always been that the Vienna Circle had better politics than the Frankfurt School. I think kind of manifest.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
But like that's something that is now, I think, can be fed back into the culture of contemporary philosophy in a way that I think is a good thing. But
so I see in the chat people are referring to books that basically, I mean, I think wrongly demonizes analytic philosophy for being apolitical and for somehow encouraging but I think it's actually being, regardless of the field you're in, right, being an American academic or public figure, I mean, any field, I mean, and so I think it had to do more with the general natural anti-communist mood. I think it had all of that to do with it. But at the same time, you could see that a lot of the so-called, radical Marxists or the radical left that, people refer to will have spent time in the United States as well, right? So that whole story doesn't really make sense to me. And there was even an article recently in the Jacobin, maybe not so recent, maybe like 6 months ago, one year ago, something like that, where that sort of it's a kind of 2023 replay of that story. And I really I think there's a little bit of truth in it, but it just doesn't really come together for me.
I also think that continental philosophy, and something that we haven't mentioned so far, but I will mention it, is like, I think continental philosophy is an Anglophone phenomenon. Like,
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's not philosophy as practiced on the continent.
Right.
It's the Anglophone reception of principally
absolutely.
German and French.
Exactly.
Right. And especially in Anglophone contexts.
Yes.
I think there's always been a pressure. And to some extent, this is because of the institutional situation of continental philosophy.
Absolutely.
Whereby it's kind of institutionally emerged out of like French and German departments and literature departments, and it's been associated with certain aspects of the humanities, right?
Yeah.
So, because of that association, there's always been a kind of pressure to present it as political and as more political than it is.
Absolutely. Yes.
In a way that, like, so, you know, people can, because they've applied Derrida to something, that's considered to be
right. Exactly.
And actually, Derrida is one of the most like conservative liberal
thinkers
possibly.
I completely agree. Right. So if you I sort of think about, like, for example, Hilary Putnam, who's, you know, kind of not a hardcore analytic philosopher, but certainly the dawn of American philosophy for roughly 20, 30 years, you know, in the post-war period. And, you know, he's an avowed and committed communist. He lived on communes. I mean, when he taught at Harvard University, you know, I mean, this is not, this is, you know, I mean, it's just that I think you don't have the culture of the public intellectual. Like, you don't have the Sartre Beauvoir at the Café Flore, like, and people recognizing these like leftist sort of people in the news. You really have people who are able to decompartmentalize, right? So Monday to Friday, they're in the philosophy department teaching sort of logical empiricism. On the weekends, they're marching in the streets, right? I mean, you could sort of think about another figure like Chomsky, who is a public intellectual, who sort of, you know, that there is a certain kind of demarcation between, you know, his linguistics and his linguistics and his sort of political activism, right? So it's
it is also come back to this question of systematicity, whereby there's this expectation. Like I said, this like systematicity involves this kind of connection between the theoretical and the practical. And so there's this expectation,
right,
that your theoretical stuff must have practical or political implications, and that expectation's never been present at all within the analytic tradition. Whereas it remains to be a huge thing within you know, Anglophone continental context. In fact, like, you can almost guarantee that at every sort of mainstream continental conference there will be a question about a paper which is what is the political consequences of this, and it's and that's a question that would be completely at home and de rigueur in a continental context, and just alien in an analytic one.
I mean, when it does happen, sometimes it is very refreshing, very interesting, actually, moment sometimes, you know, when people give you know, some paper on metaphysics, and then there's some kind of there's some kind of political glimpse that comes out that becomes really a very interesting thread, and so that's very practical, that's very, very precious. But often in kind of continental context, it's like, oh, you know, every paper has to have some kind of, and then it just becomes really like posturing, and it ends up really being complete nonsense.
Absolutely.
And at best, right? And at worst, really, there's a kind of illness there, which is a kind of it's what Marx calls idealism, right? So if you follow the, say, thesis on Feuerbach, this idea that the problem with the Feuerbachians is like, oh, if we get the philosophy right, if we just finally get the metaphysics right, then we can deliver the true society to people. Then we can really achieve justice, and perhaps that is part of the liability of the systematic philosopher, as you said, right? The connection between the good, the true, and the beautiful, is that it somehow has to come in a piece, right? And that politics somehow has to do with first figuring out like what the real thing is, right?
I think the issue, I mean, it's definitely a danger of the systematic ideal, right? and again, this gets totally toxic. In fact, like for a lot of
Yes.
years, it
Yeah.
took quite a while to get into Badiou, and now I'm into Badiou.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
But for a long time, like I was really wary of it because my initial exposure to it was people being like, I don't know anything about the set theory, but the politics, like it's got political consequences. We've got a new weird posture with this.
Yeah.
And I think that's an unfair.
That's what's real for me. What's really interesting with, but for figure, and then we're totally kind of off topic. I hope Anthony can be okay with us doing this.
He's going to come back. He's going to keep.
But the thing is that you know what Badiou actually says about politics. It's very it's not highly theoretical, right? So it's really almost banal. I mean, it's sort of to say you have to organize, you have, so in terms of practical. So it's not as if you read some theory like Foucault and something like that, you develop some new understanding of modern societies. And you're saying what we've been doing so far is wrong. And we need this way now, this new way of organizing, because the gap has shifted somehow, something like that. With Badiou, you actually have something that basically say, no, actually everything we've been doing up to now has been correct. We just need to do more of it, right? So there's no sort of like, you know what I mean? Like he will develop some, of course, some insights here and there, but it doesn't come from the depths of his system, right? It's sort of his views.
I don't know, like this, the whole thing of fidelity to truths is like there is something there. There is a theory of agency and value and
well, that's a different, that will maybe hash that out in another context. But what I do want to say is that what I've always found really refreshing about Badiou is that insofar as politics is about discipline and practice, actually the theory can theorize it, but it doesn't actually inform it. It's not as if the theory will offer you some new magic weapon or some new magic key, whereas like, for example, the turn to the body, for example, like all the
I completely agree.
Like, what is complete, so let me get back to Anthony's question, which is what is interesting, I guess, about this divide insofar as it continues to exist. Is that the question, Anthony?
Yeah, the question was like, we have this sort of taken for granted narrative that we read a lot of, and I suppose if we don't want to keep retelling the same story, how do we kind of move it forward? Or maybe perhaps what Pete would want is just to sort of
I mean,
throw it out completely. So.
I think the point isn't so much to throw it out or whatever, but it's sort of like, I think these are institutionally real. I think that the divide is institutionally real insofar as how French departments are run in terms of how German departments are run and philosophy departments. And it's going to be different in different countries. So you go to Argentina, it's going to be one way. You go to New York, it's going to be another way. You come to United Kingdom, it's going to be another way. And so, like I also emphasized in the article, like a lot of this isn't going to change because we decide that we're no longer going to use the term or to adopt another term, right? It's all about funding and how these institutional. So insofar as it's institutionally real, it's real, right? And so we just have to kind of navigate it in for those with positions in these institutions, reach out to those colleagues in French and sort of, acknowledge in solidarity that you're working in the same discipline, right? If that's the case. But for example, like in my institution, there are a lot of folks in physics. Now we're getting beyond the Analytic-Continental divide, but a lot of folks in physics that part of their work is extremely philosophical, and they don't have a place for them to and people to kind of think through some problems. Well, come to the philosophy department. We'll sort you out. We'll have these conversations with you. So it's just about the kind of larger group like solidarity that you can build with people across these divides, right? I mean, and actually one of the things that I wanted to put in the essay, but I didn't, was that when I first started as an undergraduate, I would hear people use the expression, well, that's not philosophy, right? And I really haven't heard that sentence. And that was all the time, right? All the time. All the time. And it would be used by the analytics who basically say, you know, it's usually against somebody like Derrida that's like sort of has a certain writing style, elliptical, let's say, writing style. And then it would be, then I would hear it from the phenomenologists who are like, well, those analytics, they're just playing with their little formulas, right? They're just, you know, and to some degree, I mean, you kind of understand what they're saying, right? Like I agree with my analytic professors that yes, there's a little bit too much language play in Derrida for clarity. And then you would agree with your continental professors who say, look, I mean, those philosophical problems are too constrained by formalism, and they somehow cannot think that the formalism at one point represented things that had other dimensions, right? So you know, but for them, it's like, that's not philosophy. You know, the other, that what they do over there, it's not philosophy. But and then actually I joined the University of Milan department in 2015, and they were going through their little war where all the continentals, so you know, a lot of these hires had done their education in the United Kingdom and in the US and had returned to Italy, and they have sort of slowly gained power, right? And so the phenomenologists are like, hey, you know, instead of 8 units of the history of philosophy, include, you know, and phenomenology, like a history of philosophy done in this phenomenological way, all of a sudden you had all this stuff on logic and the philosophy of perception and stuff like that. And they got really upset and they wanted to break off, right? They wanted to split the department in two and join and create a new sub-department in the history department, which would be the history of ideas department, where they could continue doing phenomenology and Heidegger and the rest. So, you know, I mean, these tendencies do kind of exist in certain places, but more, you know, I haven't really heard that is not philosophy for like a good 10 years. And I think that generally is a very good sign in institutions. Now the question is,
although I think
yeah.
one thing about, I mean, I completely agree with you. That's what's said. I haven't heard that in quite a long time.
Yeah.
But I do think, a lot of people still think it.
Yeah. Yes.
I just think it's said a lot less.
Yeah.
But that just reinforces the importance of the point that it's an institutional divide. Like it's literally something that won't go away until a lot of people die.
Yeah. It's kind of a Kuhnian paradigm shift.
It's still there. It's still deep. It still has its own immune responses. They're just different, less powerful, perhaps.
Also, I think philosophy in general has become a lot more inclusive.
Yeah.
So I think there's this idea that, well, you know, I'll do my thing over here and they can do their thing over there. And why do I feel the need to police what philosophy is? I think there's just less of that. And I think that's actually already a great turn, right? Because, you know, I think it used to be that PhD advisors would kind of actively shut down their PhD students' interest and say, oh, don't do that. You know, focus on this thing that is way more important. Become a specialist in this. Whereas like if a logician had, hey, I'm going to join a Hegel reading group, I think they're like, yeah, sure, like go do it, you know, figure out, you know, and they may make a joke about it, but it's not going to, you know, cut. So yeah, so in general, I think it's just a much more friendly time to do philosophy than before. And I came from some US departments that were very sort of in the context of the philosophy talk, people get very mean. I mean, people like normally very friendly people get really kind of mean, and that's also, that culture has also started to wash. So that's nice.
Well, I was sort of trained at Warwick, and Warwick basically had the equivalent of like a demilitarized zone down the middle of the department. It was like analytic and the continental side kind of like really going at each other.
Right.
Mainly the analytic side going at the continental side, but like
fair enough.
Kind of hostility that I think has gone away mostly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was a very
well, but it's also very interesting that from that very department then emerges some of the kind of thinkers that have really kind of melded the two together.
Yeah, but I also think that it's significant because the other thing I learned at Warwick is that you'd think doing a bit of both would mean you get to kind of talk to both sides openly, and you get to be kind of like in the middle. But in many ways, what it means is you get attacked from both sides. And I think that's also the lesson of Warwick. Like,
that's the liability.
Interesting things that were produced at Warwick are not taught at Warwick.
Yeah. No.
Okay, so I'm going to come in with one more question before the Q&A. I just want to apologize to anyone in the chat who's asked me questions. I can't really do the multitasking thing so well, but thanks for I can see that there's a conversation going and that it's all relevant to the topic, so I appreciate it. And please send any questions to the Q&A, but I just wanted to put this one to Pete to maybe bring in a couple of things he said. So you were talking about truth and beauty and goodness, and I just saw, when I was looking into this, I sort of was reminded of some of Richard Dawkins's tweets. So I found one that says, continental philosophy, in scare quotes. What kind of search for truth is region specific? Continental chemistry, ? Continental algebra, ? What nonsense? So I just thought I'd put that kind of thing to you. I mean, obviously it's a big question and it probably has to be a fairly short answer, but what is this idea of truths that perhaps can be understood as regional truths, or truths that may be more applicable in some areas than others?
So I'm not a big fan of any kind of idea of regional truth. I'm a Platonist, right? But there is such thing as, like, truth isn't you can't just consume it directly, right? There's no direct revelation, right? All truth is something that requires scaffolding and infrastructure, right? Even in mathematics, right, you've got to have some kind of syntax you start with, which is to some extent arbitrary, right? And it's from that arbitrary starting point that you find your way to something potentially necessary, right? And with philosophy, there's no philosophizing without tradition, right? You can move between traditions. You can use the shifts in perspective to give you insight, right? But you always start by learning a language, right? And so it's important to keep those languages alive, right? Especially if you think that there is value in shifting perspectives and being multilingual and being able to see how two different kinds of thinkers might have perspectives on the same insight that make that insight sharper. So I recently job interview put together sorry, I might be going into too much, but I did recently did a comparison between the Chinese political tradition and the standard European canon. And it's really cool being able to compare like Hobbes and Rousseau to like Xunzi and Mengzi, right? Where you have very, very similar arguments about human nature and how it's related to politics. But the differences also reveal things. Which is great.
I mean, also not just like, right. I mean, I agree with you, but I think that these national, I mean, again, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? So there's certain kind of national formations of the practice of philosophy. And then there's the Analytic-Continental divide, right? Those are two separate things, right? They're connected, but they're separate things, right? So, but I think like certain thought patterns, certain strategies for presenting and solving problems get ingrained in national traditions, in linguistic traditions. So, for example, in France, you do philosophy in secondary school, in class terminale, and you're taught the history of philosophy. Then you enter, if you go and study anything sort of in humanities or in philosophy, you're taught a certain way of doing philosophy. And, some of it you might think, oh, that's calcified or whatever, but there are certain strategies and certain ways of solving a problem, certain ways of even posing a problem that are national. And it's not one text or one thinker, it's actually a whole family of interrelated ways of thinking, right? Patterns of thinking. And there's a way in which that works its way into a language. The way that it infects, that it infects politics, the way it infects, and those kinds of things, that I think that is actually something that my colleagues in Italy, for example, was afraid that they were losing as the department got, I mean, there is a little xenophobia in there, yeah, for sure. But at the same time, you could see, like, from to try to understand their perspective, that there is something you lose when everything just becomes Lewis, and and also there are strategies for solving problems, ways of posing problems that, of course, already imply that a solution should look more like this.
Though the other side of the turn, like, where if I was to be as charitable as I can be to Dawkins, right, and be like, where there is something wrong with the idea, and again, continental philosophy is an Anglophone idea, yeah, right? Yeah. Is that as it exists in European, in Anglophone philosophy departments, it isn't a living tradition. It's parasitic, right? Yeah. There can't be, yeah, an original continental thinker in the Anglophone world, right? You're waiting for the next French guy, who has a big book that can then be studied, right? And so even if you think that these strategies and these problematics and these things that were alive, at least as late as the late 20th century in France, right, are worthwhile and important and have insights that need to be carried forth, right? It's actually very hard to do that within the context. Like, there is a sense in which, even if there's a regional truth there, the pursuit of that truth is hampered, because you can't do it in your own name. All you can do is write another paper about why this might be something that's already implicit within this thing.
No, I don't know anymore, right? I mean, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it could be. So I'm thinking about Tzuchien, for example, right? Who's not French, but Argentinian.
For the purposes of Anglophone continental philosophy, Tzuchien is French, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Correct. But he's publishing his papers first in English. I mean, there's a certain, I don't know, there's a certain kind of, we're in a again, it's getting weird. This, I guess, just to reiterate it's just getting really weird. And
I love the weirdness. It's just it's not getting weird fast enough. At least it didn't get weird for me in my career. Get weird enough.
Well, just you wait. I think we're gonna see an acceleration of things. Hopefully.
Anyway. But people should read Gabriel Tzuchien. He is genuinely really good.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So let's turn to a couple of questions then. I mean, we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. I mean, Elka asks a question that I suppose a lot of people attending today will be asking, because we get a mixture of academics and non-academics at these events. And obviously, one of Tzuchien's main points in his essay was that this is largely a academic division and that has lots of ramifications in that world. But what, if any, is the sort of interest or ripple effects of this divide outside of academic philosophy? Do you have any thoughts on that, Tzuchien?
Well, like, I mean, I think that my previous point about how certain patterns of thought, certain ways of kind of figuring out what comes first, what comes second in solving a complex philosophical question, that's like maybe in the public sphere, right? Kind of. So I think some of the worst things in the sort of public discourse now really come from Anglophone analytic style ethics, for example, effective altruism, just all that kind of stuff, right? And what it does is it really unproblematically, naturalistically take up individuals' preferences, statistical methods as if they were real, right? Instead of tools to understand reality from a certain framework, right? Which they are. I mean, I have nothing against statistics. It's just that they are tools. They're mathematical tools for understanding a facet of reality, right? And I think what has been going on in consequentialism in the last say 20 years is that those tools themselves become these reified natural objects, which then then sort of in the kind of naturalization process. I think what the weirding of the divide can do, what sort of just arm students with a little bit more skepticism about whatever those givens in their culture, right? So the givens of like the individual, the givens of the sort of utility, utility maximization and all of that. Pardon, it's mumbo jumbo to me. Not real. So those kinds of things, right? So they sort of immunize, let's say, students to sort of think, well, okay, well, if we want to think about preferences, we maybe within a very small context, maybe a very specific context, we can use those tools, but it's not, not for the extinction of the human species or this kind of all this long-termism debate, right? And that's sort of like those fundamental categories is actually what's gone wrong. And I think just having these other sources for thinking ethics from the ground up, I think that's, and that's also, I think, true to study philosophies from other national traditions, maybe getting back to the Dawkins question, right? Like, so cultures that don't think of the individual as the zero ground of thinking about human flourishing, right? I mean, so you can think of Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy as philosophical linguistic traditions, like I said, where certain strategies are ground into the language over thousands of years of people practicing philosophy in those languages, that these assumptions just like seem absurd, or at least you have to argue really hard for why they should have pertinence, whereas often you walk into these rooms where people just kind of unproblematically accept the premises of the problem, and you're like, what's going on? Am I the only one who thinks this is insane?
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, I basically agree with you on effective altruism and long-termism and just utilitarianism in general. Like econometric, it's what's weird about it is really it's economics, it's econometrics kind of becoming
That's right.
ethics, become politics. It's all
yeah, that's right.
But I can also to kind of put a bit of balance on it from the other side. So Tzuchien's always emphasized that this divide, it's an institutional thing. What that means is the way its influence flows into society is also something you kind of see institutionally, and it's important. So say like, it has influence outside of academic philosophy, but there's also there's sort of two layers, right? There's academic philosophy, there's academia more generally, and then there's the wider culture outside of that. And there's a kind of interesting interface between academia and the rest of society, particularly when it comes to politics and political ideas. And as I say, continental philosophy has traditionally had its influence downstream in the humanities, in sociology, in literature, in
fine art, music.
And a lot of what is considered to be sort of radical theory with a capital T, right, is basically an offshoot of continental philosophy, not just as a tradition, but like as an institutional thing, right? It absorbs a lot of the same language and strategy and impulse, right? And that stuff has percolated into the wider culture. And so, some of this stuff has percolated. Not all necessarily with good consequences. In fact, this is the part of the sort of frustration behind the whole war over the word woke itself, right? Is that the way that word has been taken up makes it, in fact, quite hard to talk about certain ways in which certain styles of thinking that have become popular in aspects of the left, right, do come from a kind of academicized campus sort of way of thinking, which is, you know, influenced by continental philosophy, right? Without immediately like falling back into the absolute horror that is the anti-monstrosity, right? But there is, just as there's this influence of analytic ethics, and indeed analytic political philosophy, right, into some of the worst tendencies of liberalism. There's also some influence of continental philosophy into some of the worst.
No, that's true. That is
Marxism, and it's
that is true. I mean, I
has less power, much less power.
I worked for a while in a kind of an art institution, and I mean, you know, great friends and all, but sometimes the interface between art and philosophy or the theory department was a kind of the kind of quip or the kind of little paragraph blurb way. So the way that fine art sometimes borrows from philosophy sometimes is the kind of that one essay or the one couple of sentences that intrigued them. And so it can have also this like kind of parasitic relationship. And I suppose that's maybe what you're saying. So all this theorization of identity and gender, instead of understanding it as part of a larger debate and perhaps systematics, some of that identity stuff is just ripped out and just
that's part
reified.
But I'd also say, like, there are certain, like, so there's a classic tendency within a lot of continental thinkers to do this kind of like this move where the big concept contaminates everything. Right? It's very common within Derrida. Like, you can't escape the contamination of whatever it is. Right? And this becomes a very characteristic way of thinking about capitalism, about patriarchy, about, you know, any of the big systematic, and that's that feeds into a very kind of a sort of politics that combines both a very kind of bombastic posturing, a kind of very negative inability to act. And I basically I find myself in context like that and I go, oh, this feels like being in grad school. right? Because it's the same kinds of easy generalizations.
Exactly.
And strategies for defending those easy generalizations. Like,
that's right.
Basically, if I was to kind of sum up what I've been saying, there's certain kinds of rationalizations, right, that are very common within continental philosophy. Rationalizations for not having to think about certain things that become really handy in other contexts. And they're incredibly frustrating. But you know, as much as people in those contexts, my politics are much closer to them. You know,
no, it's true. It's true.
You know, but there are positive aspects here. Like it is important to mention that the good stuff that comes out of the tradition of theory and, you know, theory and things like this, a lot of it is steeped in connection to continental thinking. So there is positive influence there as well. It's just, you know, be aware.
Okay, so we're pretty much at time. I'm just going to do a quick fire round where you're going to have to answer big questions in literally one sentence. So from George, I'll put this one to Pete. Why is he wrote systemicism, but I think your word was systematicity. But anyway, why is systematicity important? One sentence.
Because explicitness is good and self-consciousness is good, right? At some point, We've got to be able to ask, what are we doing, why, and what are the constraints on that, right? And big questions like that, which are important in life as much as anything else, right? They bottom out, and you've got to be willing to hit that bottom, and that bottom's going to be where all of these different things connect, right? But no longer just focus on one small question. You've got to, right? You've got to be willing to dive as deep as the questions go, and to do that is to be systematic.
Brilliant. That was a fantastic answer. Thanks, Pete. One to Tzuchien from Eri. Does philosophy need to be separate from politics? We've talked about philosophy and politics quite a lot, but that's maybe one angle.
Yeah. Now it, of course, I'm gonna do the philosopher thing and say it depends on what you mean by my politics. So in terms of, no, we don't need to separate them, but we need to be very aware of what we're doing. I mean, so coming up through certain continental, as we mentioned with Pete, continental, people really think they're doing politics when they're writing an essay. And that's wrong. You know, that's wrong. That's very wrong. And sometimes, you know, going and talking to your neighbors about their rent, that's much more political than, you know, finding some hitherto unknown interpretation of Hobbes, right? I mean, so no, do politics, do it. Does not forbid you to think about it philosophically. That's nothing stopping you from that. But to just think about it is actually where I think a lot of people go wrong. So.
Brilliant. Final question to Pete. When, if ever, is the prolixity that continentals are famous for warranted?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, when, if ever, is the well, the word I used was prolixity. I just know it because someone referred to Heidegger as a prolix charlatan. So basically the impenetrability of style that they are famous for. When, if ever, is it warranted?
I mean, it's not so much that it's warranted as that it's tolerable, I suppose. I mean, there's two sides to it, right? One, I think sometimes a certain kind of linguistic density can have a stylistic draw all its own, right? It's not for everyone, right? But it's certainly like some of why people read Hegel is the specific kind of difficulty it presents, right? There is something enjoyable about the particular kind of prolixity, right, on offer, which is not the same as that on offer in Heidegger or on offer in Husserl, right? So there is a kind of stylistic draw to that kind of density and bombast and to some extent obscurity, right? Some people just like and enjoy obscurity, right? But also there's a question, like sometimes the issues that are being thought through are so hard to think through it that the price of doing business is a certain kind of impenetrability. And yeah, maybe someone can come along later and clarify stuff, right? I'm a big believer that you should be able to re-explain philosophers in your own words, in words that aren't necessarily their terminology and certainly aren't in their style, right? But you know, there's a first time for everything, including expression, right? And the first time the ideas come out, sometimes they come out in a way that is hard to understand.
I know Anthony said that we were only allowed one sentence, but I really have to jump in here. So,
okay, sorry.
You know, in the early 20th century French tradition, I mean, the thing that people always said was, to be clear is to be French. To be clear is to be French. I mean, and if in certain moods, if you read Sartre, he's, you know, a clear essayist, you know, very, very clear writer. I blame the Germans. So once they discovered Husserl and Heidegger, and so once Husserl and Heidegger became the sort of the way to do philosophy, then they started writing like them.
Yeah.
And all of the, like, sort of the, starting with the kind of the existential, sort of phenomenologists, existentialists, all the way down to those folks that we're more familiar with, they were all had been infected by this kind of Heideggerian, this kind of German kind of prolixity. And again, I think that's part of what makes somebody like Badiou very attractive, is that he's not like perfectly limpid, but he does not indulge as much in those kind of word jumbles as his colleagues.
Though the other thing I would say is, and like Badiou's a good example here, is that there is a certain, okay, prolixity is the wrong word, but I sometimes use this word bombast. There's a certain willingness to make very big, broad strokes claims, bold, broad strokes claims within the continental tradition, that as much as anything has staying power. Because big kind of broad claims that aren't like bogged down in qualifications and relating to context are the kind of things you can read 50 years later.
Absolutely.
Or, oh my word, this still speaks to me. Whereas you read technical papers in analytic philosophy from the 40s and you're like, what? Why would anyone ever read this ever again? Like, and so
agree.
And so, like, the example I was going to pick is Badiou's book on ethics is fantastic. People should pick it up because it's totally nothing like reading analytic ethics. Precisely because it's just big, sweeping claims. Sweeping claims.
Actually, and that's another example, right? He wrote that for high school students who have to do philosophy in their final year, as a way to help them revise for their exams, right? Test your claims against this, right? So anyway, that's
Just a final thing, Pete, what's the name of the book? Because if people are looking, isn't it got the word evil, or maybe
Ethics,
it's even called
an essay on the nature of evil, is it? Or
I want to say the banality of evil.
No, it's not the banality.
No, not the. Oh, that's Hannah Arendt. Sorry, that's
I've got a copy of it somewhere, but it's, if you just search Badiou ethics, it'll turn up. And it's a great little book. So refreshing. It, like I say,
on the understanding of evil.
On the understanding of evil. Because I think his whole big claim is that what's been lost is the concept of evil, and like the concept of evil needs to be reclaimed in a secular way. And his way of articulating that's really, I think, very challenging. But it's challenging in a way that's light and breezy and bold, and we're thinking like, why aren't I reading more philosophy books like this?
I mean, but that is the kind of the essayistic tradition of like Diderot and Voltaire and the Condillac and people like that, right? I mean, that is a significant French genre of philosophical writing, is the sort of pithy, sweeping.
And it's what the academicization of philosophy
has killed,
deprived us of. And it deprived us of it even in what counts as the sort of English speaking like academic, the English speaking political and essayistic world. It still has a tendency to devolve.
So you might, so the English, in the English language, you might have seen it in sort of Isaiah Berlin, right? He's another writer in that style, sweeping. There are two kinds of freedom, right? Like this is, French Revolution versus American Revolution. Like these are two things. They're just clear representations of two ideas. And, even if you might dispute with him about whether or not they were true, whatever. But, here it is, clear, simple, bold, out there.
But I'm thinking even stuff like, so I'm a big fan of, what started out as Zero books and then became Repeater and emerged again. And I think what those guys do is really good. But even the stuff there is arguably still like very academic. Like it's still got the ticks. It's more accessible. Oftentimes there's a different kind of sort of essayistic, sort of like almost anecdotal style. But you're not going to read someone write an essay and just be like, look, this is evil, right? Like we need to think about evil, and this is what evil
Yeah, yeah.
is, and just like big brush strokes,
Absolutely.
you know. And at least it's rarer, and it's I feel like we've lost something for the inability to do it.
I think, I mean, it's just we just need more avenues for philosophers to actually write for the general public. Because it's sort of like these days, you know, that doesn't, and also even, you know, in my work, I do produce a lot of translations, and it's like even the translations, they don't count really as academic work, right? It's just it's sort of ambient value, but it's not, nobody's going to say, oh, you've completed a significant work there, but even if you have, you know, and so and a popular book is not counted as sort of
much better off writing 3 essays that no one but the reviewer is ever going to read.
Absolutely, yes. And again, institutional blinders and constraints. So